A woman stands alone on her porch, watching three black carriages roll toward her ranch, carrying the papers that will take everything her dead father left behind. She has no money, no allies, no way out. But just as the banker unfolds the court order, the sound of hoofbeats explodes from the west road. A stranger rides in at full gallop, dismounts, and without a single word to her begins stacking gold coins on the hood of the carriage. $2,300, every last cent she owes. He pays it all and sends them away. She has never seen this man before in her life. But here's the thing. He didn't do it out of kindness. He did it because he's running from something far more dangerous than debt. And the secret buried beneath her land? It's worth killing for. Her father already died for it, and she might be next. If you love stories of rugged cowboys, untamed frontiers, and love forged in dust and gunfire, you're in the right place. Welcome to Cowboy Chronicles channel, where the Wild West comes alive through tales of courage, sacrifice, and romance under open skies. This is a story that reminds us, real strength isn't about never being broken. It's about choosing truth over silence, even when the truth costs you everything. And sometimes, love doesn't ride in to save you. It rides in to stand beside you. If this story speaks to your soul, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me, would you have trusted the stranger? Share this with someone who needs a good Western tale tonight. And if you haven't yet, subscribe and ring that bell so you never miss a ride with us. Now, let's begin. The dust cloud on the horizon looked like the hand of God reaching down to crush everything Abigail Reynolds had left in this world. She stood on the porch of the ranch house her father built with his own two hands 20 years ago, her fingers wrapped so tight around the cedar railing that her knuckles had gone white. The wood still smelled like him if she pressed her nose close enough, pine sap and tobacco, and the faint sweetness of the oil he used to rub into the grain every spring. She had not done that in months. She could not afford to fall apart. Not today. Not with what was coming down that road. 3 black carriages rolled toward her property in a line, their wheels kicking up a trail of pale dust that hung in the October air like smoke from a brush fire. The territorial bank seal was painted on each door in gold leaf that caught the afternoon sun and threw it back like a warning. Abigail had been expecting them for 2 weeks. She had written letters. She had begged for extensions. She had ridden into town 3 times to plead her case at the bank office in Santa Fe. And 3 times she had been turned away by clerks who would not meet her eyes. Now they were here, and she was out of time. She was 24 years old. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a braid that hung past her shoulder blades, and her green eyes held the kind of weariness that belonged on a woman twice her age. Her dress was clean but faded, patched at the elbows. Her boots were worn thin at the soles. She looked exactly like what she was, a woman who had been fighting alone for too long and losing ground with every passing season. The first carriage stopped in the yard. A tall, thin man climbed down, his dark suit somehow unwrinkled despite the long ride from Santa Fe. He had a mustache that drooped past his chin and a leather satchel under one arm that Abigail knew held the papers that would strip away everything her family had built. His name was Howard Grenville, and she had met him once before at the bank, when he had explained in his quiet, careful voice that the bank could not extend her any further consideration. 2 more men followed from the other carriages. Younger, broader, carrying measuring tools and inventory ledgers. They spread out across the property without waiting for instruction, as if they had done this many times before. One of them walked straight to the corral and began counting her horses. Another headed for the barn with a ledger already open in his hands. Grenville approached the porch. He stopped at the bottom of the steps and looked up at her. His eyes held no sympathy, but his hands, Abigail noticed, were not steady. They trembled just slightly as he pulled a document from his satchel and unfolded it. "Miss Reynolds," he said, "I am here pursuant to a court order issued by the Territorial Court of New Mexico, authorizing the seizure of this property and all assets contained therein, in satisfaction of a delinquent loan in the amount of $2,300. You have been notified of this action on 3 previous occasions and have failed to remit payment or reach a satisfactory arrangement with the bank. I am sorry. That last part sounded like something he had added on his own. It did not help. Abigail descended the steps slowly. Her boots kicked up small puffs of dust with each footfall, and she felt the October sun press down on her shoulders like a physical weight. In the corral, her horses shifted and snorted, sensing the tension that hung over the place like a thunderhead. "I asked for more time," she said. Her voice was steadier than she felt, which was good because inside she was coming apart at the seams. "I have 2 buyers interested in my horses. Good buyers. I just need 1 more month." Grenville shook his head. "The bank has been more than patient, Miss Reynolds. 4 months in arrears. $2,300. I have my orders." She watched one of the inventory men put his hands on her mother's rocking chair. The one that sat on the porch where her mother used to shell peas in the evenings while the sun went down. Something inside Abigail cracked like ice on a winter pond. Not all the way through, but enough to feel the cold water underneath. Her father's voice came to her then, not a memory she wanted. The one she carried like a stone in her chest. His face on the pillow, skin like yellow paper, his hand gripping hers with the last strength he had. "Don't ever let anyone take this land, Abby. It holds something worth more than gold." She had thought he meant the memories, the years of work and love her parents had poured into this soil. She did not know yet how wrong she was. And underneath that memory, the other one. The one she never spoke aloud to anyone. The night his fever spiked to its worst, she had ridden out to check the cattle on the south fence because 2 heifers had gotten loose and she was afraid of losing them. She had been gone 4 hours. When she got back, the lamp was still burning in his room, but the hand she reached for was cold. He died while she was counting cattle. She should have been holding his hand. She should have been there. "Please," she said to Grenville. The word tasted like ash. "This is my home. My father built this place." Grenville opened his mouth to respond, but something stopped him. Not her words. Something behind her. Something approaching fast. The sound of hoofbeats coming hard from the west road made everyone in the yard turn at once. A lone rider was pushing his horse at full gallop, the animal stretching out with every stride, a trail of dust billowing behind them like the tail of a comet. The rider sat tall in the saddle, his dark brown duster flapping behind him like wings, a black hat pulled low, a red bandana tied around his neck, and beneath him a magnificent paint horse, black and white patches gleaming with sweat. He reined in just outside the cluster of carriages, and the paint danced sideways for a moment, tossing its head. The cowboy dismounted in one fluid motion and removed his hat, and Abigail got her first clear look at his face. He was not what she expected. Not handsome in the clean-shaven way of the men who came courting with flowers and empty promises. His face was weathered, shadowed by several days of stubble. A faded scar ran across his left cheekbone, thin and white against his tanned skin. His dark hair fell past his collar, and his eyes were gray. Not the soft gray of morning fog, but the hard gray of gunmetal. And in those eyes, something she could not name. Something haunted and heavy and old. He looked at the carriages, at the men with their ledgers, at Grenville standing stiff with his court order. Then he looked at Abigail, and their eyes met. She expected pity. That was what everyone gave her these days. Poor Abigail Reynolds, all alone on that ranch, in over her head, too proud to ask for help. She braced herself for it. What she saw instead was recognition, as if he were looking at a reflection of something inside himself. "What is happening here?" he asked. His voice was deep, carrying a slight Texas drawl that stretched his vowels and softened his consonants. "This is official bank business," Grenville said, straightening his jacket. "It does not concern you, sir." The cowboy looked past Grenville to Abigail.
looked at her hands, still curled into fists at her sides, at the way she held her spine straight even though everything around her was falling apart. "I asked what is happening," he repeated, "and the lady looks distressed, which makes it my concern." Grenville sighed. "The lady is in default on her loan. We are here to seize the property. Now, if you will kindly step aside." How much does she owe? It was not really a question. It came out flat and direct, like a card laid face up on a poker table. Grenville blinked. "I beg your pardon. You heard me. The debt." "How much?" $2,300, Grenville said. A thin smile crossed his lips. "Perhaps you intend to pay it yourself." The cowboy reached into his duster and pulled out a leather pouch. It was heavy. It clinked with the unmistakable sound of coin. He untied the strings and began counting out gold pieces onto the hood of the nearest carriage. $20 gold pieces, one after another, stacking in neat columns that caught the afternoon light and threw it back in warm yellow flashes. The metallic ring of each coin hitting metal sang out across the silent yard. Abigail watched with her mouth open and her heart hammering against her ribs. She could not speak. She could not move. She could only watch this stranger, this man she had never seen before in her life, count out more money than she had ever seen in one place. When he reached the last coin, he stepped back and wiped his hands on his duster. $2,300 in United States gold currency. Count it if you need to. The yard was silent, except for the wind and the nervous shuffling of horses. Grenville stared at the pile of gold as if it had materialized out of thin air. Then he moved forward mechanically and began counting, his lips moving without sound, his fingers sorting the coins with the practiced efficiency of a man who handled money for a living. The other bankmen gathered around, watching. The counting took several minutes. When Grenville looked up, his face held an expression Abigail could not quite read. Shock, certainly. Frustration. But something else, too. He looked at the cowboy, and for just a moment, something flickered across the banker's face that looked almost like fear. Not the fear of losing a business transaction. Something deeper. As if he had recognized something in this stranger that Abigail could not see. "It is all here," Grenville said quietly. "Every dollar." "Then I believe you have no further business on this property," the cowboy said. "I suggest you take your money and go. This is highly irregular. We will need documentation. A proper transfer of the debt. Send the papers to the ranch. We will sign whatever needs signing." "But you are done here today." Abigail finally found her voice. It came out sharp and hot, surprising even herself. "Who the hell are you?" "I did not ask for your charity, and I do not want it." The cowboy looked at her. Up close, those gray eyes were even more unsettling. Not cold exactly, but careful, guarded. Like a man who had learned a long time ago to keep the most important parts of himself hidden. "It is not charity," he said. "It is an investment. And you can pay me back or shoot me, but either way those men are leaving your land." There was a silence between them that felt like the moment before a storm breaks. Then Grenville began scooping coins back into the pouch, his movements jerky with irritation. And the other bankmen started packing their ledgers and measuring tools. It took another 20 minutes of grumbling and paperwork before the three carriages finally rolled back down the road, leaving nothing but dissipating dust clouds in their wake. As the last carriage disappeared around the bend, Abigail noticed Grenville looking back through the small rear window. Not at her, at the cowboy. And the expression on the banker's face was not the anger of a man who had just lost a legal seizure. It was the look of a man who had just watched someone light a match in a room full of gunpowder. Abigail turned to the stranger. He was securing his paint horse to the hitching post, moving with the easy confidence of a man who had spent most of his life in the saddle. Up close, she could see more details. The duster was worn but quality made. His boots were good leather, broken in but cared for. And at his hip, beneath the duster, the faintest outline of a holstered weapon. "You just paid $2,300 for a woman you have never met," she said. "I want to know why, and I want the truth." He met her eyes again. That same look. Recognition and something else. Something she would not be able to name for a long time yet. "My name is Ethan Turner," he said. "I have been working cattle drives out of Texas for the past 6 years, saving every dollar I made. I came to New Mexico looking for land. I was in town 3 days ago when I saw you at the general store arguing about your credit. I heard the bankmen this morning talking about coming out here. Something in me just could not let it happen." She stared at him. "That is not the whole truth." A beat of silence. Then, almost imperceptibly, the corner of his mouth twitched. "No," he said, "it is not. But it is all I have got for today." She should have told him to leave. Every ounce of sense she had, every lesson her father had taught her about trusting strangers, told her to send this man on his way and figure out the rest on her own. But $2,300 of his gold was riding in those carriages, and her ranch, the only thing left of her family, was still standing because of it. "You can sleep in the barn," she said. "We will talk terms in the morning." She turned and walked into the house without looking back. She closed the door and leaned against it and pressed her hands over her face and did not cry. She had forgotten how. Ethan Turner knew how to read sign on the ground. Hoofprints pressed into soft mud. Boot tracks cutting through dust. Blood trails gone cold on hard-packed earth. He had spent 10 years learning the language of the land, and it had never failed him. But the face of the woman standing on that porch with a rifle across her chest was terrain he could not map. He unsaddled his paint horse in the barn, working by the last gray light that filtered through the slat walls. The barn was old, but solid. Good bones. The stalls were clean, the tools organized, the hay stacked with the kind of careful attention that spoke of someone who knew livestock and respected the work. Whoever maintained this place knew what they were doing. He laid out his bedroll in an empty stall, arranged his saddlebags, and then pulled the Colt Peacemaker from inside his duster. He checked the cylinder the way he did every night. 6 rounds. He removed one, turned the cylinder, and replaced it. The metal was warm from being pressed against his body all day. On the walnut grip, a small etching caught the fading light. A ghost with hollow eyes, no bigger than a thumbnail, carved into the wood with a knife point. His mark, or rather the mark of the man he used to be. He wrapped the gun in an oilcloth and tucked it beneath his saddle where no one would find it unless they were looking. The truth about why he was here was more complicated than what he had told Abigail Reynolds and considerably less noble. Ethan Turner was not even his real name. He had been born Ethan Greer in a small town outside San Antonio, the son of a deputy sheriff who believed in the law and died because of it, shot in the back by a man named Collie Whitmore while trying to serve a warrant. Whitmore stood trial and walked free because he had money and friends and the judge owed favors. Ethan was 16 years old. His mother remarried within the year to a man who made it clear there was no room for a dead lawman's boy under his roof. So Ethan left. He hired on with a cattle outfit and learned the trade from the ground up. But the work was slow and the pay was worse. And the anger inside him was a living thing that grew teeth. By 18, he had started hunting bounties. By 20, he was known. By 23, he had a name that made men turn pale when they heard it. The Gray Ghost. 17 men he had brought in, dead or alive. All of them carrying legal warrants. All of them guilty of something. He told himself that mattered. He told himself he was doing what his father had done, just without the badge. The money was good. He saved every coin, never drank, never gambled. He had a goal and the discipline to reach it. Then came the Garrett boy. Billy Garrett, 17 years old, wanted for cattle rustling in Bayard County. The bounty was $50. Ethan tracked him for 2 weeks across the hill country and found him camped by a creek with 30 stolen head and a look in his eyes that was more scared rabbit than hardened criminal. The boy told Ethan he had stolen the cattle to feed his 3 younger sisters after their father died, and the bank took their farm. Ethan brought him in anyway. A warrant was a warrant. The law was the law. They hanged Billy Garrett on a Tuesday morning in April. The boy cried for his sisters the whole way up the gallows steps. The rope snapped his neck clean, which was a mercy, and Ethan collected his $50 and rode out of town and threw up on the side of the road and did not stop riding for 3 weeks. That was 2 years ago. He had not taken a bounty since. He changed his name, drifted west, and eventually came to New Mexico territory looking for the one thing he had wanted since he was 16 years old. A piece of land. Something permanent. Something that could not be shot in the back or hanged from a rope. He found the Reynolds Ranch 3 days ago. Remote, tucked into the far corner of the valley, surrounded by open range with clear sight lines in every direction. It was perfect for a man who needed to disappear. The woman who owned it was about to lose it. Paying her debt was the fastest way to secure a place to hide without anyone asking questions he could not answer. That was the plan. But watching her stand alone on that porch, one woman against 3 carriages full of men in dark suits, something in Ethan shifted. Something he had not planned for and did not want. He recognized her. Not her face, not her name. He recognized what she was. A person standing alone against something too big to fight, too stubborn to run, too proud to bend. He knew that feeling. It lived in his bones. He did not just want the land anymore, he wanted to deserve to stand on it. The barn door creaked. Ethan's hand shot to his hip before he could stop it and closed on empty air. The gun was under his saddle. He cursed himself silently and turned. Abigail stood in the doorway holding her father's Winchester rifle. It was a good weapon, well maintained, and she held it with the ease of someone who had grown up with firearms. She was not pointing it at him, not quite, but it was not pointing away from him either. "Most honest men do not work in the dark," she said. He looked down at his hands and realized he had been fixing the broken barn door hinge. By touch, in near total darkness. He had not even thought about it. It was an old skill, learned in years of night camps and ambushes, of working without light because light made you a target. He had done 1,000 tasks in the dark. His hands knew how to function without his eyes. "Most honest men have not had the kind of life that makes the dark feel safer than daylight," he said. He kept his hands where she could see them. She studied him for a long moment. Her green eyes caught the moonlight coming through the slats and held it. "If you are planning to rob me, you picked the wrong target. I have got nothing left to steal. Except that stubbornness," he said. "That seems to be in surplus." Something flickered across her face. Almost a smile. She caught it and hardened again, but he saw it, and it changed something in the air between them. She turned to go back to the house, then she stopped, turned back. Her expression had shifted from wary to sharp. Something had been bothering her, and she had finally figured out what it was. "How did you know my name?" she said. He went still. "What?" "When you were talking to Grenville, you never asked my name, but at supper tonight you called me Abigail." "I never told you that." Silence. The horses shifted in their stalls. Outside, a coyote called from somewhere on the ridge, and another answered. "I heard the bankmen say it," he said. "No." She shook her head slowly. "They called me Miss Reynolds. Every single time." The silence that followed was heavy enough to press the air out of the barn. Ethan held her gaze and said nothing, because there was nothing he could say that was not a lie. And the one truth available to him, that he had followed her from town and learned her name from the shopkeeper because he needed this ranch as a hiding place, was worse than silence. She waited. He did not speak. She went inside and closed the door, and he heard the lock turn. Ethan stood alone in the dark barn with his jaw clenched tight, and the uncomfortable realization that he had made his first mistake before the partnership had even begun. He had been so careful for 3 years. New name, new history, new habits, and he had given himself away with a single word spoken without thinking. He did not sleep that night. He lay on his bedroll, staring at the barn ceiling and listening to the sounds of the land. Wind through the mesquite, horses breathing, the creak of the windmill turning slowly in the breeze. And sometime around 2 in the morning, another sound, footsteps, light and careful, approaching from the east. Not Abigail. Someone else. He moved to the barn window without making a sound. The moonlight was strong enough to see by, and he watched a figure on foot move along the tree line at the edge of the property. A man, medium build, moving with purpose, pausing every few yards to study the ranch house, the barn, the corrals, scouting. The figure stopped near the main gate, crouched, and spent a full minute studying the ground. Then he stood and walked back the way he had come, disappearing into the darkness, heading east. Ethan waited a full hour before he went out to examine the tracks. Boot prints, good boots, nearly new. The stride was measured and confident. This was not a drifter or a curious neighbor. This was someone who had been sent to look at something specific. The tracks headed east, toward Victor Crane's ranch. When Abigail came out at dawn, she found the horses fed, the barn door hinge repaired, a fire built, and coffee boiling. She also found Ethan crouching near the fire pit, studying the hard-packed earth. "What are you looking at?" she asked. "Footprints," he said. "Someone came to your ranch last night, around 2 in the morning. They walked the perimeter, studied the house and the barn, and left." Her face went pale. "Who?" "I do not know. But the tracks head east." He watched her eyes follow the direction of his gesture. East, toward the largest spread in the valley, toward thousands of acres of wire-fenced range owned by a man whose name she had not yet spoken, but whose shadow, Ethan was beginning to understand, stretched across this entire valley like a stain. He said nothing more. But she noticed his hand drift to his hip where a holster should have been, and his fingers close on empty air. The well had been dry since June. Abigail knew this because every morning she lowered the bucket on its fraying rope and heard the sound she hated most in the world. Iron striking dry stone. That hollow clank echoing up from the darkness like the land itself was laughing at her. She had been hauling water from the creek a mile south, loading barrels onto the wagon and making the trip twice a day when the heat was at its worst. It was back-breaking work for one person, and it was killing her horses slowly. A ranch without reliable water was a ranch with a death sentence, and Abigail had known for months that she was running out of time even before the bank came knocking. But on this particular morning, walking the eastern boundary of her property with a man she did not trust and could not stop watching, she learned that her father's land held a secret that changed everything. They had been riding since dawn. It was Abigail's idea, a practical necessity disguised as a power play. If Ethan Turner was going to be her partner, he needed to see what he had invested in, all 300 acres of it, including the parts that were falling apart. She wanted him to understand exactly how bad things were. She wanted to watch his face when he realized his $2,300 in gold had bought him a share of a sinking ship. She led. He followed. That was important to her, and she made sure he understood it without having to say the words. This was her land, her father's legacy. He was a guest here, no matter how much gold he had paid. They rode the fence lines first. Ethan said little, but she could see his eyes taking in everything. The gaps in the barbed wire where posts had rotted and fallen. The sections of fence that leaned at angles that meant one good wind would bring them down. The water troughs that were dry and cracked. The grazing land that was more dust than grass after 2 years of drought. She watched him the way she watched an unbroken horse. For tells. For the moment when the reality of the situation would register on his face, and he would start calculating how quickly he could cut his losses. But that moment did not come. Instead, he stopped his paint horse near the eastern boundary where a low ridge of sandstone broke through the surface of the earth like the spine of some buried animal. He swung down from the saddle and crouched at the base of the ridge, running his hands over the rock. Then he stood and walked about 20 paces north, crouched again, and pressed his palm flat against the ground. "What are you doing?" Abigail asked from the saddle. "Come here," he said. She dismounted and walked over. He was kneeling beside a pile of stones that she had always assumed was just a natural formation. But now that she looked closer, she could see the stones were placed, not fallen. Flat sides fitted together, gaps filled with dried mud. "Help me move these," he said. They worked together in silence, lifting stones and setting them aside. Beneath the cairn was a wooden cover, warped and weathered but still solid. Ethan lifted it and Abigail heard a sound that made her heart stop. Water. Not a trickle. Not a seep. A full underground spring, running clear and cold over a bed of smooth stones. The water was maybe 4 feet down, accessible by bucket or by pipe, and from the way it flowed, Abigail could tell it was not seasonal. This was a year-round source, fed by something deep beneath the sandstone. "Your father knew," Ethan said quietly. "He built this cover, disguised it with brush and stones. He hid it because he understood what men do for water out here." Abigail's throat tightened until she could barely breathe. Her father's last words. "Do not ever let anyone take this land, Abby. It holds something worth more than gold." She had thought he meant memories. She had thought he meant love. He meant water. In the New Mexico territory, in a valley plagued by drought, a reliable underground spring was worth more than a gold mine. Whoever controlled this water controlled every ranch for 30 miles, every herd, every crop, every family. "Why would he hide it?" she whispered. "Because he knew," Ethan said. "He knew that if anyone found out about this spring, they would kill him to take it." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. And for the first time, the circumstances of her father's death felt less like misfortune and more like something else entirely. They covered the spring again and rode to town in silence, each carrying the weight of what they had found. Tucumari was small, a main street of packed dirt lined with a dozen businesses, a general store, a feed supply, a church with a bell that had been donated by the valley's most prominent citizen and rang slightly off-key, a saloon called the Desert Rose with batwing doors and a piano player who knew exactly 4 songs, and Rosa Dominguez's cantina, tucked between the blacksmith shop and the livery stable, where the food was good and the gossip was better. Rosa met them at the door. She was a handsome woman in her late 30s with dark hair streaked with silver and eyes that missed nothing. She had been Abigail's only real friend since her father died. The only person in Tucumari who had never once suggested that Abigail sell the ranch and find a husband. She set a plate of enchiladas in front of Abigail and a cup of coffee in front of Ethan, and she looked at the cowboy the way a hawk looks at a snake, measuring, calculating. "So this is the man who paid your debt," Rosa said. She did not sit down. "Crane has been asking about him. He is not happy someone paid off that note. He had plans for your land, Abigail." "What kind of plans?" Ethan asked. Rosa looked at him for a long moment. "The kind a man like Victor Crane does not share with people like us. But I will tell you this. My husband Miguel refused to sell his blacksmith shop to Crane 2 years ago. Miguel was a strong man, healthy. He died 3 weeks later from what the doctor called a horse kick to the head. I know horses, Mr. Turner. I know the marks they leave. And I know the marks they do not leave." She said it flatly, without drama, and the absence of emotion made it worse. Ethan said nothing. But Abigail saw his jaw tighten. They finished their meal and headed back toward the ranch. On the road out of town, Abigail's wagon threw a wheel. The axle pin had sheared clean, and the wheel rolled into the ditch and lodged against a rock. Abigail swore under her breath and climbed down to assess the damage. Before Ethan could dismount, the sound of approaching horses came from behind them. 3 riders came around the bend at an easy canter. The lead rider was a man in his 50s, tall and straight-backed, sitting a beautiful sorrel gelding with the easy grace of someone who had spent a lifetime in the saddle. He wore a quality vest over a clean white shirt, and his silver hair was combed back neatly beneath a wide-brimmed hat. His face was tanned and handsome. The kind of face that belonged on a territorial governor or a railroad baron. Victor Crane. He pulled up with a smile that was warm and wide and reached all the way to his eyes. "Miss Reynolds, what a misfortune. Let my boys help you with that." His two ranch hands were already dismounting, and Crane himself swung down and helped lever the wagon while his men worked the wheel back onto the axle and hammered in a new pin from a kit they carried in their saddlebags. The whole operation took less than 15 minutes, and through it all, Crane was gracious, charming. He asked about Abigail's health. He said he was sorry to hear about the bank trouble. He offered to send his veterinarian to check her remaining cattle, free of charge. "You have been through enough, Miss Reynolds. Neighbors should help each other. That is how we survive out here." Abigail found herself nodding. He was so smooth, so genuine in his concern, that for a moment she thought maybe she had been unfair. Maybe Rose's suspicions were just grief talking. Maybe Crane was exactly what he appeared to be, a successful rancher who looked after his community. Then she glanced at Ethan. He was sitting his paint horse off to the side, silent, watching. And she noticed something that raised the hair on the back of her neck. His eyes were moving, not randomly, systematically. Crane. Two ranch hands, positions, distances, the tree line to the left, the ditch to the right, escape routes. He was counting and calculating with the unconscious precision of a man who had spent years assessing threats. When Crane mounted up and tipped his hat and rode away with his men, Abigail turned to Ethan. "What was that?" she said. "What was what?" "The way you looked at him, like you were measuring the distance to his gun hand." Ethan did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice was careful. "Some men smile because they are friendly. Some men smile because they want you to stop looking at what is behind the smile. Which one is Crane? I do not know yet, but I intend to find out." On the ride home, they passed the western boundary of Crane's property. Miles of fencing stretched in both directions, well maintained and strong. But Ethan pulled his horse up and studied the wire for a long moment. "Those fences are not built to keep cattle in," he said. "They are built to keep people from seeing what is on the other side." And on the road, a detail that might have meant nothing to most people, but that made Ethan's eyes go hard. A small group of cattle grazing near the fence line. Their brands looked wrong. Not fresh exactly, but layered. Old marks burned over with new ones. "Those are rebranded," Ethan said quietly. "Stolen cattle, run through his operation and marked with his iron. I have seen it before." Abigail stared at the cattle, then at Ethan. "How do you know what rebranded cattle look like?" He did not answer that one at all. That night, after Ethan had gone to the barn and the ranch was quiet, Abigail sat at the kitchen table with her father's papers spread before her. She had been through them a dozen times since his death, sorting bills and receipts and correspondence with the bank. But tonight she was looking with new eyes, eyes that had seen a hidden spring, and heard Rose's quiet accusations and watched a stranger count men and distances like a soldier. She found it near the bottom of the stack, an envelope she had overlooked before, or maybe not overlooked. Maybe she had seen it and set it aside because it was sealed, addressed in her father's handwriting to no one, and dated 1 week before he died. She had not been ready to open it then. She was ready now. She broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered in her father's careful handwriting. The letters were shaky, written by a hand weakened by fever, but the words were clear. "If something happens to me, look at the original loan. The numbers are wrong." Crane changed them. The loan was $800. He made it $2,300. God forgive me for not being brave enough to fight him. Protect the spring, Abby. Protect yourself. Abigail read it twice, 3 times. The paper trembled in her hands and she realized she was shaking, not with grief, but with a fury so deep it felt like it started in the marrow of her bones. Her father had known. He had known that Victor Crane, the man who had helped fix her wagon today and offered to send his veterinarian, was the one who had manufactured her debt, the man who donated the church bell, the man the whole town respected. He had inflated an $800 loan to $2,300.
He had tripled the interest. He had forged documents and altered signatures and turned a manageable debt into an impossible one. And her father, too sick to fight and too afraid of what Crane might do, had written this letter and sealed it and hoped that somehow his daughter would find it in time. She had not found it in time, but she had found it. Abigail pressed the letter against her chest and closed her eyes and made a promise to the empty kitchen and the ghost of her father, and the God she was no longer sure was listening. I will protect the spring. I will protect myself, and I will make Victor Crane answer for what he has done. In 3 weeks of working alongside Ethan Turner, Abigail had watched him lift 100-pound hay bales like they were filled with feathers. She had watched him gentle a wild horse with nothing but his voice and the patient steadiness of his hands. She had watched him saw through a cottonwood trunk, thick as a man's waist, in a single afternoon, without stopping to rest. The man worked like the labor itself was a kind of penance, like he owed a debt to the world that could only be paid in sweat. But she had never seen him afraid. Not until Victor Crane rode up the drive on a Tuesday morning with a basket of preserves and a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. Abigail heard the horses first and came out to the porch, drying her hands on her apron. Crane was already dismounting, and behind him was one of his ranch hands, a quiet man named Webb, who carried the basket and said nothing. Crane removed his hat and held it against his chest in a gesture of respect that seemed genuine, but felt rehearsed. Miss Reynolds, I hope I am not imposing. My cook put up more preserves than we can eat in a year, and I thought of you. He handed her a jar of plum preserves, a packet of smoked venison wrapped in brown paper, and a bottle of whiskey that was finer than anything Abigail had ever seen. This is very kind, Abigail said. The words came out stiff. She was thinking about her father's letter, hidden now in the false bottom of her mother's sewing box. She was thinking about the word fraud, and the number 800, and the difference between that number and 2,300. Crane smiled and looked around the property with the appraising eye of a man who understood land. You have done remarkable work out here, he said. Your father would be proud. And I see your new partner has been busy. He nodded toward the corral where Ethan was working with a young mare. Ethan had not come over to greet the visitor. He stood with his hand on the horse's neck, talking to it in a low, steady voice, but Abigail knew he was watching. She could feel it. Crane turned back to Abigail and lowered his voice to something warm and confidential. I want you to know, Miss Reynolds, that if there is anything you need, anything at all, my door is open. We are neighbors. We should look after each other. Then he raised his voice slightly, just enough to carry across the yard. Turner. That is a good Texas name. You would not happen to be related to the Turners out of Bayard County, would you? It was nothing, an innocent question. But from the corral, Abigail saw Ethan go still. Completely still. The kind of stillness she had seen in deer the instant before they bolted. It lasted only a second. Then he turned and walked over, easy and calm, and shook Crane's hand. No relation that I know of, he said. Common enough name. Crane held the handshake a beat too long. His eyes searched Ethan's face with a curiosity that had teeth behind it. Of course, Crane said. Well, it is a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Turner. Welcome to the valley. After Crane left, Abigail went inside and came back out with her father's letter. She handed it to Ethan without a word. He read it. Read it again. His face darkened with every line. Your father did not die of pneumonia, he said. You do not know that. I know that men who discover that Victor Crane is defrauding them do not die of natural causes. Not in this territory. Abigail had already come to this conclusion herself, in the dark of the kitchen, in the hours since she had read the letter. But hearing someone else say it out loud made it real in a way that her own suspicions had not. Her father, the strongest, kindest man she had ever known, murdered by a neighbor he had once called friend. She told Ethan everything. The letter, Rosa's story about Miguel,
The original loan amount of $800 versus the $2,300 the bank had demanded. The altered signatures. The tripled interest. Ethan listened without interrupting. When she finished, she expected him to be angry. Instead, he was quiet for a long time. "We need to be smart about this," he said. "You do not attack a man like Crane head on. He has money, he has the law in his pocket, and he has people who will do whatever he tells them to do. If you ride into town and accuse him of fraud and murder, he will destroy you before you can blink." Abigail's jaw tightened. "So we do nothing. We do everything. But we do it carefully. You let him think he has won. You smile when he brings his preserves and his whiskey, and you build a case so strong that when you bring it, he cannot talk his way out. You talk like a man who has fought a war." He met her eyes. "I have." The silence that followed was thick with things unsaid. 3 days later, Crane proved that he was not content to simply wait for the legal system to work in his favor. Abigail woke at midnight to the sound of fence posts snapping. She grabbed the Winchester and ran out to find a quarter-mile of her eastern fence cut, the wire pulled back and rolled into coils. Her cattle, 32 head that represented everything she had left, were streaming through the gap and scattering across the open range. Ethan was already mounted. He had heard it before she had, which raised questions she did not have time to ask. They spent 4 hours in the dark, riding hard, turning cattle back toward the ranch. The terrain was treacherous. Arroyos cut the land like knife wounds, invisible in the darkness until your horse was right on top of them. Rattlesnakes were curled in the cool sand at the bottom of every gully. The cattle were spooked and stubborn, running from shadows and doubling back at every opportunity. They worked side by side in the moonlight, communicating with hand signals and short, sharp whistles. Abigail knew cattle. Ethan knew them better. He anticipated their movements before they made them, cutting off escape routes and funneling the herd back toward the property line with the economy of motion that came from years of practice. Near the arroyo that marked the northern boundary, Abigail's horse stumbled in a gopher hole and she was thrown forward, catching herself on the saddle horn but losing her stirrups. Ethan was beside her in an instant, his hand on her waist, steadying her. "Easy," he said. "I have got you." She looked at him in the moonlight. His face was close, too close. She could feel the heat radiating off his body. Feel his heartbeat under her palm where her hand had landed flat against his chest. It was fast. Faster than the riding warranted. Neither of them moved. Then Abigail stepped back. "Do not," she said. He released her immediately. "I was not. I know." That is what scares me." They finished rounding up the cattle in silence, and by the time the last head was through the temporary gate Ethan had rigged, the eastern sky was turning from black to gray. They were exhausted, filthy, every muscle aching. Abigail went inside and came out with 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to Ethan and sat down on the porch steps. He sat beside her. Not too close. Close enough. "Before you came here," she said, "who were you really?" "Someone trying to become someone better," he said. She looked at him for a long time. Then she looked out at the land, at the cattle settling back into their grazing patterns, as if nothing had happened, at the gap in the fence that would need mending come full daylight. She let it go. For now. Later that week, true to his word, Crane sent his veterinarian to check Abigail's cattle. The man was professional and thorough. He treated 2 sick calves and gave Abigail advice on managing her herd through the drought. He did not ask for payment. He did not mention Crane's name. He simply did the work and left. It was the kind of gesture that made Abigail doubt everything. Could a man who sent free veterinary care to his struggling neighbor really be the same man who had manufactured her debt and possibly murdered her father? Could Crane be both things at once? The question gnawed at her, and she could see it gnawed at Ethan, too. That afternoon, Abigail rode to the general store for supplies. When she returned and unsaddled her horse, she found something under the saddle blanket that had not been there when she left. A folded piece of paper, creased and slightly damp with horse sweat. She opened it. One line, written in shaky handwriting she did not recognize. Check the original loan papers. A friend. She had already checked them. She knew the numbers were wrong. But now she also knew something else. Someone inside Crane's circle was afraid, and whoever it was, they were trying to help her. She folded the note and put it in her pocket and did not tell Ethan about it. Not yet. She was learning slowly that sometimes the smartest thing you could do was hold your cards close and wait for the right moment to play them. There were two kinds of men on the frontier: those running from their past, and those whose past had finally caught up. Ethan Turner had been the first kind for 3 years, 2 months, and 14 days, a span of time he knew exactly because he counted every day the way a prisoner counts the marks on his cell wall. As of this morning, standing in Rosa Dominguez's cantina, staring at the face of the one man alive who knew every sin he had ever committed, he became the second kind. Jack Dalton was sitting at the bar like he owned it. He was 31 years old, handsome in the easy way that made women trust him and men underestimate him. He had dark hair and a smile that showed too many teeth, and he was buying drinks for the locals, laughing at their jokes, making friends the way a spider makes a web. When he saw Ethan walk through the door, that smile widened into something that was not a smile at all. It was a predator baring its teeth. They stepped outside into the bright October sun. The street was empty. Dalton leaned against the hitching post and crossed his arms and looked at Ethan with an expression of pure, delighted malice. "The gray ghost," Dalton said, "playing house with a pretty rancher. I have to say, Ethan, I did not see that coming. Does she know what those hands have done? Does she know about Abilene, about the Garrett boy? What do you want, Jack?" Dalton's smile faded by degrees, like the sun going behind a cloud. "Crane hired me. Specifically, he hired me to make sure the Reynolds Ranch changes hands one way or another. He does not care how. He cares about the result." Ethan said nothing. "Here is the deal," Dalton continued. "You walk away. Clean. Crane will triple what you put into that ranch. You ride out with more gold than you started with, and nobody needs to get hurt. Or you stay, and I make sure your girl finds out everything, every name, every kill, every dollar of blood money in that pouch of yours. And then you leave with nothing." Ethan looked at the man he had once called brother. They had ridden together for 2 years across the Texas plains, sharing fires and watching each other's backs. Dalton had taught him to track. Ethan had taught Dalton to shoot. They had been as close as blood until the day Dalton started taking jobs that had nothing to do with warrants. Jobs where the target was whoever a rich man wanted dead. "You could still walk away, Jack, ride out, start over somewhere nobody knows you." Dalton laughed. It was not a kind sound. "Why would I do that? The money is good and the work is easy." "You were always the one with the conscience, Ethan. Look where it got you." He pushed off the hitching post and settled his hat on his head. "Think about my offer, but do not think too long. Crane is not a patient man." That afternoon, Dalton rode past Abigail's horse corral at a slow canter and fired 3 shots into the air. The sound cracked across the valley like thunder. The horses panicked instantly, 6 animals slamming against fence rails, rearing, screaming. 2 of them found the gap where a post had loosened and burst through, galloping wildly across the open range. Abigail was in the corral when the shots came. She dove behind the water trough as 1,000 pounds of terrified horseflesh stampeded past her, hooves churning the dirt inches from her head. A hoof caught the trough and shattered the edge, spraying her with water and splinters. Then Ethan was there, pulling her behind the solid bulk of the fence post, his body between her and the chaos. She looked up at his face and saw something she had not seen before. Not fear, not anger, calculation. His eyes were tracking Dalton's retreating figure with a precision that was almost mechanical. Distance, angle, wind. He was measuring a shot he was choosing not to take. Dalton turned in the saddle and tipped his hat with a grin. Then he was gone. In the silence that followed, Ethan's hands were shaking. Abigail saw it. He was not shaking from fear. He was shaking from the effort of not reaching for his gun. "Who was that man?" she demanded. "Nobody. He shot at my horses. He nearly killed me. He is not nobody." Ethan looked at her. His gray eyes were flat and empty in a way that made her skin crawl. "An old friend," he said, "from a life I left behind." She waited for more. He did not offer it. That night, Abigail left Ethan at the ranch and rode to Rosa's cantina. She did not tell him where she was going. She was done waiting for him to tell her the truth. She would find it herself. She sat across from Rosa at a back table and described the etching she had seen on Ethan's gun. She had caught a glimpse of it 3 days ago when he was cleaning the weapon in the barn. A ghost with hollow eyes, carved into the walnut grip. Rosa went very still. She stood without speaking and walked into the back room and came out carrying a leather-bound journal. Her husband Miguel's journal, the one he had kept during his years as a farrier and gunsmith. He had catalogued every maker's mark and personal mark he encountered, with notes on the owner and the weapon. Rosa found the page and turned the book so Abigail could see. "That mark belongs to a bounty hunter known as the Gray Ghost," Rosa said. Her voice was flat and careful. "He operated across Texas and New Mexico for 6 years. 17 confirmed kills. All legal bounties, all carrying warrants. But the last one, the one that made him stop, was a boy. 17 years old. Cattle theft. After that, the ghost disappeared. Nobody knew where he went." She looked up at Abigail. "Until now." Abigail felt the floor tilt beneath her. The cantina sounds faded to a dull roar. She stared at the journal page, at the crude drawing of the hollow-eyed ghost, and the world she had been carefully constructing over the past 3 weeks. The world where Ethan Turner was a good man with simple dreams, collapsed like a barn in a windstorm. The man sleeping 30 feet from her bedroom was not a cowboy who had saved his wages. He was a professional killer who had saved his blood money. The gold that had paid her debt was bounty money, money earned by bringing men to their deaths. She rode home in silence. The stars were thick overhead, but she did not see them. She was seeing Ethan's hands, the way they moved with such sure precision when he worked with the horses, the way they had pulled her to safety in the corral. Those same hands had killed 17 men. Ethan was on the porch when she arrived, mending a bridle by lamplight. He looked up when she dismounted and smiled, the open, unguarded smile that always made her chest hurt. The smile of a man who was not pretending, who was, in that moment, simply happy to see her. She did not smile back. She walked past him into the house and locked her bedroom door. Through the wood, she heard him say, "Abigail, is everything all right?" She pressed her forehead against the door with the journal page clenched in her fist and whispered to the empty room, "Number. Nothing is all right." Abigail Reynolds had kissed exactly 2 men in her life. The first was Tommy Garrett behind the church after a harvest dance when she was 16. He tasted like peppermint candy, and he fumbled with his hat so badly that it fell off and spooked the preacher's cat, and by the time they stopped laughing, the moment had passed, and whatever magic there might have been was gone. The second was Ethan Turner, in a barn during a thunderstorm with the truth about his past burning a hole in her chest. She was not fumbling at all, but that had not happened yet. First came the 3 days of silence. She did not confront him. She did not throw him off her land. She did not do any of the things that a sensible woman should do when she discovers that the man she's been working beside, eating beside, slowly and dangerously falling for, is a killer. Instead, she watched him, with new eyes, and what she saw terrified her, not because it was monstrous, but because it was not. She noticed the way he never sat with his back to a door. She had thought it was habit. Now she knew it was survival. She noticed the way he counted people every time they walked into a room. She had thought he was shy. Now she knew he was assessing threats, She noticed the way his hand drifted to his hip 20 times a day, reaching for a weapon he was trying not to carry. She had thought it was a nervous tic. Now she knew it was muscle memory written in blood. She noticed all of this and she was afraid. But not of him. She was afraid of what it meant that she still felt safe around a man who had killed 17 people. She was afraid of what it meant that when Dalton had fired those shots and the horses had stampeded, Ethan's body had covered hers before his mind had time to think. She was afraid of what it meant that every night when she locked her bedroom door, she lay awake listening for the sounds of him in the barn, and the knowledge that he was there, 20 paces away, was the only thing that let her close her eyes. On the fourth day, the storm came. It rolled in from the west with almost no warning. One moment the sky was clear blue and hot. The next it was the color of a bruise, black and purple and angry. Lightning cracked across the valley in jagged white lines, and the thunder that followed shook the house hard enough to rattle the windows. Abigail ran for the corral. The cattle were already spooked, milling in tight circles, bellowing at the sky. The creek that ran along the southern boundary was rising fast, brown water churning with debris. If it jumped its banks, the low pasture where the herd was grazing would flood. Ethan appeared beside her on his paint horse. He did not wait for instructions. He read the situation the same way she did. And they both kicked their horses into motion at the same time, racing toward the herd. What followed was 8 hours of the hardest work Abigail had ever done. The rain came down in sheets so thick she could barely see Ethan 20 yards away. Lightning struck the ridgeline 3 times, each bolt close enough to taste the metal in the air. The cattle were mindless with fear, running in every direction, and turning them toward the high ground was like trying to push water uphill. They worked as a team. No words, no arguments about who was in charge. Just 2 people reading each other's movements the way good riders read their horses. Anticipating, adjusting, compensating. When Ethan cut left, Abigail knew to swing right. When she held position at the gap in the tree line, he pushed the stragglers through. They were drenched and exhausted and covered in mud, and they moved together like they had been doing this for years. Then a cow got stuck. A big red heifer, heavy with calf, had wandered into the arroyo where the flash flood was running highest. She was belly deep in brown water, unable to find footing on the rocky bottom, and the current was rising around her. She bellowed in terror, a sound that cut through the rain and the thunder and struck something deep in Abigail's chest. Abigail dismounted and went in after her. The water was shockingly cold. It grabbed her legs and pulled, and the footing was treacherous, slick rocks and mud and debris that snagged at her boots. She got a rope around the heifer's neck and was trying to guide her toward the bank when the current surged. A wall of brown water came down the arroyo and swept Abigail off her feet. She went under. The world became dark and cold and violent. She tumbled, struck a rock with her shoulder, lost the rope, fought for the surface. Her head broke free and she gasped a breath that was half air and half water. Then hands, strong hands under her arms, hauling her up and out and onto the bank. She coughed and sputtered and blinked the water from her eyes and found Ethan above her, soaking wet, breathing hard, his face white with fear. Real fear. The kind that does not calculate distances and angles. The kind that just acts. She hit him, her fist against his chest hard enough to make him flinch. "You could have died," she shouted. "So could you. That is my choice to make." "Not anymore, it is not." The rain pounded down around them. Lightning turned the world white for an instant, and the thunder that followed was so close it vibrated in her teeth. Ethan's hands were still on her arms. Her fists were still against his chest. They were both shaking from cold and adrenaline, and something else. She kissed him. It was not tender. It was not gentle. It was the kiss of 2 people who had been drowning separately and just realized they could breathe together. His mouth was warm against the cold rain, and his arms came around her and pulled her close, and she felt the solidity of him, the strength, and she kissed him harder. He kissed her back. Rain and mud, and the electric charge of a storm that was not just in the sky. When they finally broke apart, gasping, he rested his forehead against hers. "Abigail," he said. His voice was wrecked, She put her hand over his mouth. Not yet. Not here. They saved the heifer, got her out of the arroyo and up to high ground where the rest of the herd was milling nervously. Then they rode to the barn and unsaddled the horses and hung the tack to dry. The barn was cold, but it was shelter, and the sound of the rain on the roof was almost peaceful compared to what they had been through. They sat on hay bales, wrapped in horse blankets, shivering, close enough to share warmth, close enough to feel each other breathing. "You want to know who I am," Ethan said. His voice was quiet, tired. "I will tell you." And he did. He told her about his father, the lawman, shot in the back, the killer walking free. He told her about leaving home at 16 and hiring on with a cattle outfit, about the anger that grew inside him like a fire he could not put out, about the first bounty he collected, a horse thief in Abilene. The man drew on him and Ethan shot him dead and felt nothing, nothing at all. And that feeling, that absence where something should have been, scared him worse than the bullet. He told her about the years that followed. 17 men, cold camps and long rides, and the sound a body makes when it hits the ground. He did not glorify it. He did not make excuses. He told it flat, the way you tell a doctor where it hurts. He told her about Billy Garrett, 17 years old, crying for his sisters on the gallows steps. $50 in Ethan's pocket. "I watched him drop," Ethan said. "I had the bounty money in my pocket. $50 for a boy's life. I rode out of that town and threw up on the side of the road, and I did not stop riding for 3 weeks. The rain hammered on the barn roof. The horses stamped and shifted in their stalls. Abigail sat very still with the horse blanket pulled around her shoulders and her hair dripping down her back, and she listened. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. Long enough that he thought she was not going to speak at all. Then she said, "The gun," with the ghost on the grip. His face went white. Every trace of color left his skin, as if someone had pulled a plug. "Rosa told me," she said. "I have known since 3 days ago. Her husband was a gunsmith. He catalogued the marks. The gray ghost. 17 kills. The silence that followed was the loudest thing in the barn, louder than the storm, louder than the rain. It pressed against the walls and filled every corner and made the air too thick to breathe. "You knew," Ethan said. "I knew. And you did not say anything." "I was waiting," Abigail said. "I was waiting to see if you would tell me yourself." He dropped his head. His hands hung between his knees, and she could see them shaking. "I need time," she said. She stood and pulled the horse blanket tighter. "I need to think about what this means. Do not touch me until I tell you that you can." He nodded without looking up. She reached for the red bandana around his neck. It had been pressed against a cut on her hand during the storm, the cloth soaked with her blood and his where he had split his knuckles on a fence post. She pulled it free and held it. He did not try to stop her. She walked out into the rain and crossed the yard to the house. She went inside and locked the door and sat in the kitchen with water dripping off her clothes and pooling on the floor her father had laid 20 years ago. After a long time, she opened the trunk that held her father's belongings. She was looking for something to ground her, something solid from a time when the world made sense. She found a letter she had overlooked before. Or maybe she had seen it and was not ready. The envelope was yellowed with age. The sender's name was written in a careful, educated hand. Victor Crane. The date was 2 weeks before her father died. She opened it. One line. "Last time I asked to buy. Next time I will not be asking, not be." Below it, in her father's shaking handwriting, a note he had added before sealing the letter away. "God help me. God protect Abby." Crane's letter to her father was a death sentence written in polite handwriting. The words were civil. The meaning was murder. And Abigail Reynolds, who had spent 2 years believing that pneumonia had taken her father from this world, now understood that she had been grieving the wrong cause of death. She sat at the kitchen table until dawn. reading the letter over and over, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something less devastating. They did not. Last time I asked to buy. Next time I will not be asking. And her father's response, written in a hand trembling with fever or fear or both. God help me. God protect Abby. Victor Crane had threatened her father. 2 weeks later, her father was dead. And in the years since, Crane had methodically inflated her loan, altered her documents, and sent his banker to seize the very land he had threatened to take by force. She rode to Rosa's cantina at first light. Rosa took one look at her face and locked the front door and poured 2 glasses of whiskey and sat down. Abigail showed her the letter. Rosa read it. Her face did not change, but her eyes went very dark and very still. It is the same, Rosa said. The same thing that happened to Miguel. A refusal to sell, then an accident, a sickness, a horse kick. And Crane standing at the funeral looking sorrowful and offering his condolences. He does not do it himself, Abigail said. He has someone. Rosa nodded slowly. Jack Dalton. He came to town 6 months before Miguel died. Hired on at Crane's ranch. Charming, handsome, all smiles. And then my husband was dead, and Dalton was the one who found the body and called the doctor and told everyone what a tragedy it was. The words settled between them like stones. He is the same man, Abigail said. The one who shot at my horses. The one Ethan knows from before. Rosa looked at her sharply. From before. They rode together, years ago, before Ethan came here. They were bounty hunters. Rosa was quiet for a long moment. And your man, does he know what Dalton has done? He knows Dalton is dangerous, but I am not sure he knows the rest. About your husband, about my father, then you need to find out, Rosa said. And you need to decide whether Ethan Turner is the kind of man who would have done something about it if he had known. Abigail rode home with Crane's letter in her pocket and a cold clarity in her mind that felt like the first frost of winter. When she arrived at the ranch, Ethan was splitting wood behind the barn. He looked up when he heard her horse and set the axe down carefully. He could read her face. She could see him reading it. She did not dismount. She sat her horse and looked down at him and said everything she needed to say. Your old friend. Jack Dalton, he works for Victor Crane. He has been working for Crane for at least 2 years. During that time, Rosa's husband Miguel was murdered, made to look like a horse kick. And my father received a threatening letter from Crane 2 weeks before he died. Ethan's face went very still. Did you know, she said, did you know what Dalton was doing when you rode together? Ethan set down the axe. I knew he was taking bad jobs, jobs without warrants. I left because of it. But I did not know he was here. I did not know about your father or Miguel until Beckett told me. Beckett, the marshal. He recognized me from an old poster. He has known who I am since the 2nd week I was here. He told me about Dalton and Crane. He asked me whose side I was on. And you did not tell me any of this. I was trying to protect you. The words hit her like a slap. Protect me. You lied to me. You told me you were a cattle driver who saved his wages. You are a killer who saved his blood money. Your old partner is a murderer working for the man who destroyed my family. And you knew, maybe not all of it, but you knew enough, and you said nothing. She could see the words landing. Each one struck him, and he did not defend himself against any of them. My father died because a man he trusted kept secrets from him, she said. Her voice was shaking now, the cold clarity cracking. And here I am, making the same mistake. She reached behind the kitchen door and picked up her father's Winchester. She worked the lever and put a round into the chamber and aimed at the ground in front of his boots and fired. The shot cracked across the valley. Dust jumped at his feet. The horses in the corral screamed and ran to the far fence. Get off my land, she said. Ethan looked at her face. At the tears she was fighting with everything she had. At the rifle that was not aimed at him but close enough to make the point. And he understood something that he could not argue with. She was not angry because he was dangerous. She was angry because he had lied. And underneath the anger was something worse. She was terrified that she loved a man she could not trust. He saddled his paint horse in silence. She stood on the porch with the rifle and watched him. He did not speak. He did not plead. He mounted up and turned his horse toward the gate. At the gate, he stopped. Without looking back, he reached into his duster pocket and pulled out the red bandana, the one she had taken from him in the barn. He had another, a spare. He folded this one carefully and tucked it under the gate post where she would find it. Then he rode. The sun was going down when he stopped on the ridge overlooking the ranch. He could see the house below, a single lamp burning in the kitchen window. She was sitting at the table. He could imagine what she looked like. The rifle across her lap, the letter spread before her, the weight of the world on shoulders that should not have had to carry it. He had done this, not Crane, not Dalton. He had done this by choosing silence over truth, by telling himself that hiding was the same as protecting, by believing that the man he had become could outrun the man he used to be. The sound of hoofbeats behind him made him turn. Jack Dalton emerged from the tree line on a tall black horse, grinning in the twilight. "She threw you out," Dalton said. "That is a shame. I was starting to enjoy the show." "Get away from me, Jack." Dalton pulled up beside him and looked down at the ranch. "Listen, Crane will triple what you put into that place. You ride away with more gold than you started with. Clean break. No hard feelings." Ethan said nothing. Dalton's grin faded. "Or you stay and things get ugly." "I will put you in the ground, Ethan, same as I did her friend Rose's husband. Same as I would have done to old Reynolds if his lungs had not done the job first." The confession hung in the night air. Dalton admitting to murder. But there were no witnesses, no proof. Just two men in the dark. "One more thing," Dalton said. "That murder warrant on you from Texas. The judge you supposedly killed. Crane arranged that too. Needed insurance in case you ever became a problem. You have been running from a lie he built, Ethan. Think about that." Then Dalton touched his hat brim and rode off into the darkness, whistling a tune that Ethan recognized from the old days. A song they used to sing around the campfire when they were young and thought the world was simple. Ethan sat his horse on the ridge for a long time. The lamp in Abigail's kitchen went dark. The stars came out, thick and cold and indifferent. And he thought about running. He was good at running. 3 years of practice. A new name, a new story, a new town. He could do it again. He could be someone else by next week. But someone else would not love Abigail Reynolds. Someone else would not lie awake at night thinking about the way she talked to horses in that low, steady voice, or the way she braided her hair with quick, sure fingers, or the way she stood on that porch and faced down 3 carriages of bankmen without flinching. Someone else would not carry the memory of her kiss in a rainstorm like a brand on his soul. He turned his horse and rode to town, to Marshall Beckett's house. He pounded on the door until the old man opened it, bleary-eyed and suspicious. "I need to tell you everything," Ethan said. "All of it. And I need your help to keep her alive." Back at the ranch, Abigail sat on the porch in the dark. In her hand was the red bandana. She had found it tucked under the gate post. She had known immediately who left it and why. She pressed the cloth to her face and breathed in leather and sage and gunpowder. And she allowed herself to cry. For her father, for Ethan, for herself. For the terrible, cruel unfairness of loving someone who might be exactly what she needed and exactly what she feared. Abigail Reynolds once thought the longest night of her life was the night her father died. She was wrong. The longest night was the one after she sent Ethan Turner away. She sat alone in the kitchen with a loaded rifle on the table and his bandana around her wrist and the sound of 3 gunshots in the dark that she knew came from a man who was not supposed to be there anymore. But that came later. First came the morning. She woke at dawn to the sound of something wrong. Not a sound exactly. An absence of sound. The cattle should have been lowing in the pasture. The rooster should have been raising hell the way he did every morning at first light. Instead, there was silence. A heavy, unnatural silence that made her grab the Winchester and step onto the porch, with her heart already racing. 3 of her cattle were dead at the water trough, lying on their sides with foam around their mouths and their eyes rolled back white. Poison. She checked the trough and found it. A faint chemical smell beneath the surface of the water. Someone had come in the night and poured something into the only water source her cattle used regularly. If she had not found it, if she had not noticed the silence, the rest of her herd would have drunk from the same trough, and she would have lost everything. She emptied the trough and hauled fresh water from the hidden spring, and spent the morning moving the remaining cattle to a different pasture. She worked alone. She was used to working alone. But the silence where Ethan's voice should have been was a wound she could not stop touching. Rosa rode out around noon. She came over the ridge at a fast trot and dismounted before her horse had fully stopped. Her face told Abigail that whatever she was carrying was not good news. "Crane has filed a claim of prior ownership with the territorial court," Rosa said. "He has a deed he claims your father signed, transferring the land to him before his death. The hearing is in 5 days. The judge, coming from Santa Fe, is Warren Haskell." Abigail knew the name. Haskell was known to be sympathetic to men with money and connections, the kind of judge who made his rulings based on the weight of the purse rather than the weight of the evidence. "A forged deed," Abigail said. "Of course it is forged. But it has your father's name on it and 3 witnesses who will swear they saw him sign it. Crane has been building this for years, Abigail. He has been very patient." Abigail leaned against the corral fence and felt the world pressing in on her from every side. Her father's death, the poisoned cattle, Ethan's betrayal, and now this. A forged deed and a bought judge, and 5 days to find a way to stop a man who had been planning her destruction for years. "I do not know how to fight this," she whispered. Rosa grabbed her by the shoulders. Her grip was strong and her eyes were fierce. "You are not your mother, God rest her soul, sitting in a rocking chair waiting for someone to save you. You are Abigail Reynolds. Your father built this ranch from nothing, and your mother survived Apache raids and drought and the death of 2 babies before you were born. Their blood is in your veins. You stand up, you fight, and if I lose, then you lose standing on your feet. That is better than winning on your knees." Abigail wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and straightened her spine and nodded. Rosa was right. She had been fighting alone for 2 years. She could fight alone for 5 more days. But she was not entirely alone, and she knew it. That night, lying in bed, unable to sleep, she heard the sound she had been listening for without admitting it. Soft hoofbeats on the ridge behind the house, the faintest jingle of bridal hardware, and then silence. The kind of silence that meant someone was up there, watching. In the morning, she found sign. The coyote that had been circling the chicken coop for a week was dead near the tree line. Not shot, knifed. A clean kill that left no bullet sound to carry across the valley. Someone had been close enough to the house to protect her chickens, and quiet enough that she had not heard a thing. She knew those knife skills. She knew that silence. She knew who was up on that ridge every night, keeping watch from the shadows, protecting her even after she had driven him away with a rifle shot. 2 nights later, at just past 2 in the morning, she woke to the smell of smoke. She grabbed the Winchester and ran outside in her nightgown. 3 riders were at the horse barn carrying torches. The lead rider was Jack Dalton. She raised the rifle and fired 1 shot. It struck the barn wall 3 feet above Dalton's head. He flinched but did not retreat. "Go back inside, little lady," Dalton called. "This does not concern you." 3 shots cracked from the ridge, so fast they sounded almost like one. The first shot struck a torch out of one rider's hand. The second spooked Dalton's horse so badly the animal reared and nearly threw him. The third hit the dirt exactly between Dalton's horse's front hooves. The shots were precise, expert, the work of a man who had spent years putting bullets exactly where he wanted them. Dalton fought his horse under control and looked toward the ridge. He could not see the shooter. Nobody could see the shooter. That was the point. "Gray ghost," Dalton muttered. Then louder to his men, "Ride, Now. They rode. Abigail stood in the yard with the Winchester and her heart hammering and looked at the ridge. She could see nothing in the darkness, but she raised her hand slightly, not a wave, not a greeting, just an acknowledgement, and let it fall. She went inside. She did not untie the bandana from her wrist. The next morning brought Grenville. He appeared at her door on a lathered horse, looking like a man who had not slept in days. His face was bruised. One eye was swollen nearly shut, and his lip was split and crusted with dried blood. "Miss Reynolds," he said. He would not come inside. He stood on the porch and wrung his hat in his hands. "I cannot say what I need to say. Not yet. I am not ready, but I need you to know that not everyone who works for Victor Crane does so because they want to. Some of us are looking for the courage to stop." He left before she could respond. She watched him ride away and thought about courage. How everyone was looking for it. How some people found it and some people lost it. And some people drove it away with a rifle shot and then lay awake at night wishing they had not. That afternoon she found a package on the porch step. Inside was a document she had never seen before. A wanted poster bearing the name Ethan Greer, with a description that matched Ethan Turner in every detail. Wanted for the murder of a judge in San Antonio. Below the poster was an official letter from the United States Marshal's Office in Santa Fe. The letter stated that after investigation, the murder warrant had been found to be based on fabricated evidence. The charges were dismissed. Ethan Greer was cleared of all accusations. He had turned himself in. He had walked into the marshal's office and given them his real name and submitted to questioning, and risked imprisonment, all so that a piece of paper could exist that proved he was not a murderer. He had done it for her, so she would know. Beside the documents, a single wildflower. The kind her father used to bring her mother from the meadow. No note, no words, just the flower and the truth and the silent message underneath. "I am done hiding. Here is all of me. You decide." She held the cleared warrant in one hand and the wildflower in the other. She thought about her father, who had hidden the spring and hidden the truth about Crane, and hidden his fear in a sealed letter, all to protect her. She thought about Ethan, who had hidden his name and his past and his pain for the same reason. "Protection that requires deception is not protection," she said to the empty porch. "It is a prison." She made her decision. She saddled her horse and rode to town, not to find Ethan, to find a lawyer. If Victor Crane wanted a fight in court, she would give him one. And if Ethan Turner wanted to help, he could show up on his own terms, not as her savior, as her equal. The courtroom in Tucumari was no bigger than a parlor. 12 rows of wooden benches on either side of a center aisle, a raised platform at the front where the judge sat behind a table that served as his bench, and 2 smaller tables for the opposing parties. The walls were bare plaster. The windows were open to let in the October air, and the sounds of the town drifted in. Horses, wagon wheels, the off-key church bell ringing the hour. But today, this small room held enough to make or destroy every life in the valley. A judge who owed favors, a forged deed, a reformed killer, a terrified banker, and a truth that had been buried for 2 years alongside Miguel Dominguez. Judge Warren Haskell called the hearing to order at 10 in the morning. He was a heavy man with a florid face and small, sharp eyes that missed nothing and cared about less. Crane's attorney, a polished man from Santa Fe named Whitfield, presented the claim with the confidence of someone who had already been told the outcome. The deed was impressive. Good paper, official seals. James Reynolds' signature at the bottom, witnessed by 3 men who sat in the gallery ready to swear they had watched him sign it. Whitfield laid it out methodically. Reynolds had sold the land to Crane before his death. The transaction was legal and binding. Miss Reynolds was occupying the property illegally and should be removed forthwith. Abigail sat at the plaintiff's table alone. She had not been able to afford a lawyer. She had tried to hire Samuel Morton, the attorney who kept an office above the barber shop, but Morton had declined. Too afraid of Crane, though he did not say so in those words. She represented herself. She wore her cleanest dress and her mother's cameo at her throat, and she spoke clearly and without trembling, though her hands under the table were clenched into fists so tight, her nails drew blood from her palms. She presented her father's letter, the one describing the altered loan and Crane's threats. Whitfield objected immediately. Hearsay, unverified, possibly fabricated. Judge Haskell sustained the objection with barely a glance at the document. She presented the loan documents showing the discrepancy between the original $800 and the $2,300 the bank had claimed. Whitfield argued that interest and penalties accounted for the difference. Haskell nodded. She was losing. She could feel it in the room, in the way the townspeople shifted on the benches, in the way Crane sat at the defendant's table with his hands folded and a small, satisfied smile on his face. The system was working exactly as he had designed it. Then the door opened. Every head in the courtroom turned. Howard Grenville stood in the doorway. He looked terrible. His face was a map of bruises. One eye was swollen completely shut. His lip had been split open again and was bleeding fresh. He wore a rumpled suit that looked like he had slept in it, and in his arms he carried a leather satchel that he clutched against his chest like a child. He walked down the center aisle. His steps were unsteady. His one good eye found Abigail's face and held it, and she saw something there that she had not expected. Resolve. Grenville reached the front of the courtroom and turned to the judge. "Your Honor," he said. His voice shook, but it did not break. "My name is Howard Grenville. I am a representative of the Territorial Bank of Santa Fe, and I am here to present evidence that will demonstrate the claims made by Mr. Crane in this proceeding are fraudulent." The courtroom erupted. Haskell banged his gavel. Whitfield jumped to his feet, objecting. Crane's satisfied smile vanished like smoke. Grenville opened the satchel and began laying documents on the judge's table. Ledgers, correspondence, original loan agreements with their real figures beside the altered copies the bank had issued. 5 years of fraud, documented in Crane's own handwriting and authorized by his signature. Not just Abigail's loan, a dozen others. Families across the valley who had been driven off their land by debts that were manufactured from nothing. "I am a coward," Grenville said to the courtroom. He was not looking at the judge or the lawyers. He was looking at the gallery, at the townspeople, at the faces of the neighbors he had helped to destroy. "I have been a coward for 7 years. I watched Victor Crane ruin families, and I signed the papers that made it legal. I did this because he holds debts over my head, and because I was afraid of what would happen if I stopped." He turned and looked at Crane. His bruised face was steady. "Last week, Mr. Crane sent his man Dalton to my home to make clear that my usefulness had ended. These bruises are his farewell. And I decided that if I was going to be destroyed regardless, I would rather be destroyed for telling the truth than for keeping silent one more day." The courtroom was absolutely still. Abigail realized she was crying and did not bother to wipe the tears. Crane stood. The mask of the benevolent neighbor was gone. In its place was something cold and desperate and ugly. "Dalton," he said. His voice cut across the room like a whip. "Handle this." In the back row, Jack Dalton rose from his seat. His hand moved to the pistol on his hip. Time slowed down. The courtroom door opened again. Ethan Turner walked in. He was unarmed. Abigail saw it immediately. No gun belt, no holster. His hands hung empty at his sides. He walked down the aisle toward Dalton with steady steps, and the room parted for him the way water parts for stone. His hands were trembling. Abigail saw that too. She saw the fear on his face, plain and unconcealed. He was terrified, but he kept walking. "You want to shoot someone, Jack?" Ethan said. His voice was quiet, but it carried to every corner of the room. "Shoot me. Right here. No gun, no tricks, just me." Dalton's hand was on the grip of his pistol, his fingers curled around it, but he had not drawn. His eyes locked with Ethan's, and something passed between them, the memory of campfires and long rides and a partnership that had once meant something before the money and the killing turned it rotten. "Do not make me do this," Dalton said. "You do not have to do anything," Ethan said. "You can put your hand down and walk out that door and ride until you hit the ocean. That is a choice. It is one I should have offered you years ago." The moment stretched like a wire pulled tight. Every person in the room held their breath. Then Marshal Tom Beckett stepped forward from the side door, his old revolver in his arthritic hand. And from the main entrance, two Deputy United States Marshals appeared, badges gleaming, rifles at the ready. They had come from Santa Fe on Beckett's wire, and their timing was either miraculous or carefully planned. Dalton was surrounded. He looked at the Marshals, at Beckett, at Ethan standing before him with nothing in his hands but years of regret and a willingness to die if that was what it took. Dalton's hand came off the pistol grip. He raised both hands slowly. "You always were the better man, Gray Ghost," he said quietly. They took his gun and put him in irons. Crane followed, the judge having no choice in the face of Grenville's testimony and the presence of territorial authorities. Crane was led out in irons, cursing and threatening, but no one was listening anymore. The man behind the mask had been seen, and he was smaller than anyone expected. The courtroom emptied slowly. People filed out in stunned clusters, talking in low voices. Grenville sat in the witness chair with his head in his hands, trembling. Rosa stood in the doorway with tears running down her face and whispered her husband's name. Abigail stood at the plaintiff's table. Ethan stood near the door. 20 feet of courtroom floor between them. She looked at him. The scar on his cheekbone, the gray eyes, the hands that were still shaking and that he was not trying to hide anymore. The man who had killed 17 men and wept for a boy. The man who had paid her debt and lied about his name and turned himself in to clear a warrant so she would know the truth. The man who had come back, unarmed and afraid, and walked toward a loaded gun because it was the right thing to do. She crossed the 20 feet. She took his hand. She held it. She said nothing. That was enough. Outside, Crane was loaded into the marshal's wagon. He would be transported to Santa Fe for territorial prosecution. If convicted of land fraud, forgery, and conspiracy, he faced imprisonment at the territorial penitentiary in Santa Fe. Dalton was taken to the county jail in Tucumari to await trial for the murder of Miguel Dominguez. Rosa watched the wagon roll away, and something in her face loosened, a tightness that had been there for 2 years. She turned to Abigail and hugged her with a fierceness that said everything words could not. "Your father would be proud of you," Rosa said. "I know," Abigail said, and for the first time since his death, she believed it. 3 months after the trial, Abigail Reynolds still had not said "I love you" to Ethan Turner. Not because she did not love him. She loved him with a fierceness that frightened her sometimes, a feeling so large it seemed like the New Mexico sky itself could not contain it. She had not said it because every time she gathered the words in her mouth, he would do something that made 3 words feel too small. He would come in from the barn smelling like hay and horses, and sit down at her father's table and tell her about his day in that quiet Texas drawl. And she would think the words, but they would dissolve on her tongue because they were not enough. He would stand at the corral in the early morning light with his hand on a horse's neck talking softly, and she would watch from the kitchen window and feel the words rising in her chest like a hymn. But by the time she opened the door, they had transformed into something deeper than language. He had come back to the ranch after the trial, but he had asked permission first, standing at the gate with his hat in his hands and his horse behind him, looking more nervous than a man who had once faced down Jack Dalton in a courtroom had any right to look. "If you will have me," he said, "on your terms, for as long as you will let me stay." She had pointed to the barn. "Same terms as before, Mr. Turner. You earn your place here." He nodded and carried his saddlebags to the barn, and she went inside and leaned against the kitchen door and pressed her hand over her mouth to keep from laughing or crying or calling him back. The rebuilding was slow. That was her condition, and he honored it without complaint. "I need to see you through a winter," she told him.
through a drought, through the worst days. I need to know you stay when staying is hard, not because of guilt, because you choose to. I will be here, he said, however long it takes. He gave her the Colt Peacemaker, handed it over one morning without ceremony while she was pouring coffee. I do not want to carry it anymore, he said. Keep it or bury it or throw it in the arroyo. I do not care. I am done with it. She looked at the gun, at the ghost with hollow eyes etched into the grip. She put it in her father's trunk underneath the letters and the loan papers and the cameo her mother used to wear. She did not tell him why she kept it instead of destroying it, but it mattered to her that he trusted her with the worst part of himself. He slept in the barn for 3 weeks. She could hear him some nights moving around, unable to settle. She knew he did not sleep well indoors. She knew the walls pressed in on him. She knew his body had learned to survive in ways that comfort could not easily undo. One cold January night, she appeared at the barn door with a blanket. "The spare bedroom is warmer," she said, "and I am tired of pretending I do not want you closer." He moved inside. He slept on the floor beside the open window, even though the temperature dropped below freezing, and she could see his breath in the morning air. The bed went untouched. She found it that way, and said nothing. She understood now. It was not about her. It was about the years that had shaped him into what he was, and she could be patient with those years because she was learning to be patient with her own. They worked the ranch together, truly together now, without walls or pretense. Ethan told her everything. Every man he had killed, every night he had not slept. The boy's face he saw when he closed his eyes. He told her about the warrant and Crane's fabrication. He told her about his father, the lawman who believed in justice and was murdered by injustice. He told her about his mother who chose a new husband over her son. Abigail listened. She did not judge. She did not forgive easily either, and she did not pretend that the past did not matter. But she saw him, truly, fully, every scar and shadow, and she did not look away. In return, she told him the truth she had never told anyone, about the night her father died, about riding out to check the cattle when she should have stayed, about coming home to a cold hand and a lamp still burning. "I was not there," she said. Her voice cracked like dry wood. "He died alone because I was counting cattle. I should have been holding his hand." Ethan pulled her close. His arms around her were strong and steady, and she let herself be held, which was its own kind of courage. "You were doing what he taught you to do," Ethan said softly. "Taking care of the ranch, taking care of what mattered. He would not blame you for that, not for a second." She cried. She had not cried about this, not really, not the deep, ugly crying that purges the poison from the wound. She had carried it locked inside her for 2 years, and now she let it out. And Ethan held her through all of it, and did not tell her to stop, and did not tell her it was all right. He just held on. "It was not my fault," she said finally. The words came out ragged and raw and new. "And needing you does not make me weak." "No," he said, "it makes you brave." In late February, the biggest snowstorm in years hit the valley. It came fast and hard, blanketing the ranch in white and driving the temperature down to levels that threatened the livestock. Abigail's best mare, a chestnut named Ginger, who had been bred to a quality stud Ethan had purchased the month before, chose this particular night to go into labor. The foal came wrong. Breech presentation, legs tangled. Abigail and Ethan worked side by side in the barn through the long, frozen hours, their breath fogging in the lamplight, their hands slick with blood and fluid. Abigail talked to Ginger in the low, steady voice her father had taught her, the voice that could calm any horse, and Ethan worked with careful hands to turn the foal and ease it into the world. It took hours. They were exhausted beyond reason, running on nothing but stubbornness and love. At dawn, the foal slid free, small and wet and still, too still. Abigail wrapped the foal in blankets and held it against her chest and breathed warm air into its nostrils. She talked to it the way she talked to the horses, the way her father had talked to every animal that came into his care.
"Come on," she whispered. "Come on, little one. You did not come this far to give up now." Minutes passed. The snow fell silently outside. The barn was very quiet. Then the foal's legs twitched. Its chest expanded. It lifted its head and looked at Abigail with dark, wet eyes, full of the bewildered wonder of a creature seeing the world for the first time. Then, on legs that trembled and buckled and seemed far too long for its body, it stood. Abigail laughed through tears, a sound of pure joy that filled the barn and rang off the rafters. Ethan watched her, kneeling in the straw with snowlight filtering through the slat walls. This woman who refused to let anything die on her watch. Her face was streaked with tears and sweat and blood. Her hands were shaking from cold and exhaustion. She had never been more beautiful. "I do not deserve you," he said. The words came out rough and unplanned. "I know that. But I will spend whatever life I have left trying to be worthy of this." She looked up at him, green eyes bright with tears, steady as bedrock. "I do not need you to be worthy," she said. "I need you to be real." She pulled him down and kissed him in the straw and the cold, smelling of horse and blood and the impossible sweetness of new life. Later that week, on a quiet gray afternoon when the snow had melted to patches of white on the brown hills, Abigail walked up to the grave on the hill behind the house. Her father's marker was simple, a wooden cross with his name and dates carved by her own hand. The ground beneath it was hard from winter. She stood there for a long time without speaking. Then she said the things she had been carrying. "I found the spring, Daddy. I know what you were protecting. I know about Crane. I know about all of it." She paused. The wind moved through the winter grass. "I found someone. He is not perfect. He has done things that would make you reach for your rifle. But he came back. And he told the truth even when lying would have been easier. And he stood in front of a loaded gun with nothing in his hands because he believed it was the right thing to do." Her voice broke. "I think you would have liked him. I think Mama would have too." She felt a hand on her shoulder, warm and solid and familiar. Ethan. He did not speak. He just stood with her while the wind moved through the grass and the clouds traveled across the winter sky. She leaned into him, and she let go. The guilt of not being at her father's side. The guilt of not being enough to save the ranch alone. The guilt of needing someone. She let it all go, and what was left was not empty space but solid ground. A place to stand. A place to build. They stood together by the grave until the sun broke through the clouds and painted the hills in gold. Then they walked back to the house side by side, and Abigail thought about roots. How they grow slowly. How they need time and water and patience. How they can be damaged but not easily destroyed. How the strongest roots are the ones that grow through stone. The proposal came on a Sunday afternoon in early March. They were standing by the hidden spring, the source of everything. Her father's discovery, the secret that had nearly destroyed her and had instead saved her. The water ran clear and cold over the stones her father had placed 2 decades ago, and the sound of it was the most peaceful thing Abigail had ever heard. Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out something small that caught the light. A ring, not gold or silver from a jeweler's case. It was fashioned from a single piece of metal, worked by the blacksmith in town into a smooth circle that gleamed with a dull, warm luster. "I had the blacksmith make it," Ethan said. "From the last bullet in my Colt. The one I never fired. It seemed right. Turning the last thing I carried from that life into the first thing I give you in this one." Abigail took the ring and held it up to the sunlight. It gleamed like water, like the spring running at her feet, like the future she had stopped believing she would have. "Yes," she said. He put the ring on her finger, and she put her hands on his face and kissed him beside the water her father had protected on the land her parents had built, under the sky that stretched from horizon to horizon with nothing but possibility. Epilogue. Spring, 6 months later. September of 1884. The wedding was held on the ranch under the big cottonwood tree that Abigail's father had planted the year she was born. It had grown tall and broad, its branches spreading out like arms reaching for the sky, and in September its leaves were just beginning to turn from green to gold. Rosa stood as witness. She wore a new dress, the first she had bought since Miguel's death, and she held a handkerchief that was soaked through before the Reverend even started speaking. Marshal Beckett walked Abigail down the aisle. She had asked him because someone should, she said, and he was the closest thing to a father figure she had left. The old lawman cried harder than Rosa, great silent tears that rolled down his weathered cheeks and disappeared into his collar. He had retired his badge the month before and spent his days fishing in the creek that ran through the south pasture, which Abigail allowed because she understood that some men needed rest more than they needed purpose. Abigail wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her leaner frame. Around her wrist, instead of flowers, she wore a faded red bandana that had been washed clean of blood and mud and worn soft as silk from being held through too many sleepless nights. Ethan stood at the end of the aisle in a dark suit with his hair combed back and his gray eyes shining. Around his neck on a simple chain hung the silver bullet ring, waiting to go on her finger. He looked like a man who had spent his whole life walking towards something he was afraid to believe existed and had finally arrived. When the Reverend asked for vows, Abigail spoke first. "I promise to never lock you out again," she said. Ethan's voice was steady and clear and carried to every person gathered under that cottonwood tree. "I promise to never give you a reason to." The kiss was not dramatic. It was soft and sure, and it lasted exactly long enough. The small gathering erupted in applause. Rosa blew her nose loudly enough to spook a horse. Beckett wiped his eyes with his sleeve and pretended he had gotten dust in them. Afterward, there was food and music and laughter. Rosa had cooked for 2 days. The townspeople who had watched Crane's arrest and Grenville's testimony and the whole impossible story unfold had come to celebrate not just a wedding, but a kind of redemption. Their valley had been sick for years with Crane's corruption, and now it was healing. As the sun went down and the guests drifted home in their wagons, Abigail stood on the porch of the ranch house, the same porch where she had stood when the bankmen came, the same railing her father had planed with his own hands, the same view of the valley stretching out to the horizon, painted now in the brilliant oranges and pinks of a New Mexico sunset. Her hand rested on her stomach, a secret she had not yet told Ethan, a small thing, a beginning, another root going down into the soil of the life they were building. Behind her, she could hear Ethan laughing at something Rosa had said. His gray eyes were bright with a joy she had once thought she would never see there. The haunted look had not disappeared entirely. She suspected it never would. But it had changed, softened, like a scar that fades with time but never fully goes away. She looked out at the land, her father's land, her land, their land, the cattle grazing in the distance, the horses in the corral. Carlos, their new foreman, calling instructions to the ranch hands as they buttoned down the barn for the night. The hidden spring running somewhere beneath her feet, quiet and constant, feeding the roots of everything that grew here. She thought about the dust cloud she had seen that October day. The hand of God she had been so sure was coming to crush her. She thought about the stranger who rode out of that dust with a pouch full of gold and a past full of ghosts. She thought about everything that had happened since, the lies and the truths, the fear and the courage, the moment he walked toward a loaded gun with nothing in his hands, the moment she crossed 20 feet of courtroom floor and took his hand and held it. She had been wrong about the dust that day. It was not the hand of God reaching down to crush her. It was a man, scarred and haunted and full of flaws he might never outrun. But he rode in, and he stayed, and he told the truth when lying would have been easier. And sometimes, she had learned, that was all love needed to be. Not because one man rode in with gold, but because two people chose each other, broken, honest, and unafraid, and built something no one could take away. The dust had settled. The roots had taken hold. And the land that James Reynolds had claimed and protected and died for would go on. Not because of gold or water or good fortune, but because his daughter had found someone worth trusting. And that someone had found the courage to be trusted. Abigail smiled and went inside, where the lamps were lit and the coffee was hot. And Ethan Turner was waiting for her at the kitchen table with that look in his gray eyes that still, after everything, made her forget how to breathe. She sat down across from him. He reached across the table and took her hand. The bullet ring gleamed on her finger in the lamplight. "Happy?" he asked. She laced her fingers through his and held on tight. "More than I have words for," she said. "That was enough. That was everything." This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.